Margaret's hand shot out and grabbed Clara's wrist so hard the bone cracked. "You step through that door," she hissed, her voice low enough that the guests in the parlor couldn't hear, "and I will make sure every family in this county knows exactly what kind of girl you are." Clara felt the grip tighten. 40 people were waiting on the other side of that door, and Ethan Caldwell was standing in the middle of them, watching the doorway, watching for her. If you've ever been told you don't belong in a room that was always yours, stay right here. Subscribe to this channel and drop your city in the comments. Let me see how far this story travels. Wyoming in October had teeth. Not the cold. Not yet. Though the cold was coming. You could smell it in the morning air, the way you smell rain before it hits. Know what had teeth in Silver Creek Valley in the fall of 1885 was the social season. The visiting, the suppers, the careful, deliberate business of deciding who mattered and who didn't, dressed up in good linen and passed around like a dish at a church potluck. Clara Whitmore had been on the wrong side of that deciding for most of her 24 years. She knew it. She had made her peace with it, or something that looked enough like peace that she'd stopped checking the difference. She worked. She kept her head down. She stayed in the parts of Whitmore Ranch where her presence wasn't a problem for anyone, which mostly meant the barn, the far pasture, the small room off the kitchen where she kept the accounts ledger and her own books, and the quiet company of no one at all. She was good at invisible. She had been practicing since she was 4 years old, the day her father brought Margaret home. Margaret Whitmore, née Alcott, from a respectable Denver family, with more name than money, was not a cruel woman in the way that people write about in novels. She didn't scream. She didn't throw things. She didn't make speeches about her contempt. She was something considerably harder to fight. She was a woman who had decided quietly and completely that Clara Whitmore was an inconvenience, and who operated her entire household around that quiet decision. With the smooth efficiency of someone who has arranged things this way so long, she no longer thinks of it as a choice. Clara was too big. That was the sum of it. Not just in body. Though that was part of it, and Clara knew it, had known it since she was 12, and realized that the world had a picture of what a girl was supposed to look like, and she didn't fit it. She was broad through the shoulder, strong through the hip. Built the way women in her mother's family had always been built, for endurance, for work, for the kind of life where you needed your body to actually function, rather than simply to be observed. Margaret observed it constantly. "You'll wear the gray dress tonight," she would say, the night before a gathering. The gray dress, formless, dull, was the dress designed to render Clara forgettable. "The Hendersons will be here. I'd like the evening to go smoothly." Smoothly meant without Clara. Or when Clara's absence would be too conspicuous to arrange, when her father asked for her specifically, when someone had already mentioned her in conversation and her disappearance needed explaining. Smoothly meant Clara at the far end of the table, speaking only when spoken to, wearing the gray dress, making herself as close to nothing as a living person can be. Clara had sat at the far end of that table so many times she knew the grain of the wood by heart. Tonight was not a table situation. Tonight the Caldwell family was coming. This was different. Everyone in Silver Creek Valley understood that the Caldwells were different. Thomas Caldwell had built his ranch from 40 acres and a pair of borrowed horses into the largest cattle operation in 3 counties. Ethan, 31, unmarried, quiet. In the way that money and confidence make people quiet, was by the unspoken but unanimous agreement of every family with an unmarried daughter in a 100-mile radius, the most sought-after man in the territory. Margaret had been planning this evening for 6 weeks. She had not been planning it for Clara, Violet, her own daughter. 20, with their mother's fine bones and a laugh she'd been coached since childhood to deploy at the right moments, was the point. Violet in the blue silk dress that had come from Denver specifically for this occasion. Violet positioned in the best chair near the best lamp, her embroidery in her lap, in a tableau of domestic grace that Margaret had arranged that afternoon the way a stage director arranges a set. Clara's role was the kitchen. "The Hendersons are bringing a dish," Margaret had told her that morning. "I need someone to manage the back table. You're good with that sort of thing." That sort of thing. 24 years of being reduced to that sort of thing. Clara had nodded. She'd put on her work clothes. She'd gone to the barn because there was a mare with a problem that 3 men had already failed to diagnose, and Clara had a theory, and that was more interesting than standing in a kitchen waiting to be useful in the ways she was permitted to be useful. That was where she was when she heard the wagon. She didn't look up. She was on her knees in the straw, both hands moving along Duchess's foreleg, with slow, methodical attention, running the same path she'd run a dozen times in the last 3 days, feeling for the thing she was increasingly certain was there. The mare had been restless this morning. That was good. Restless meant responsive. Responsive meant alive in a way that a horse quietly going inward was not. There, Clara murmured almost to herself. Right there. She pressed gently at a point midway up the flexor tendon, and Duchess flinched, not in pain, but in the unmistakable way of an animal saying, "Yes, that's it. That's the place." Clara sat back on her heels and let out a long breath, tension in the tendon working its way down. 3 men had looked at the hoof. The hoof was fine. The hoof was where the problem showed up, not where it lived. It lived here halfway up the leg invisible, unless you were willing to take long enough and be quiet enough to actually look. "Got you," she said quietly. "You did," said a voice from the barn door. Clara was on her feet before she'd made a conscious decision to stand turning toward the door, with Duchess's lead rope still in her hand, her heart slamming once hard against her ribs. A man stood in the open doorway. Tall, dark-coated, with the kind of face that had spent serious time outdoors, not softened by it, but settled into it, the face of someone who worked the land and didn't consider it a hardship. He was watching her hands, not her face, not her figure, her hands and the place on the mare's leg she'd been pressing. "The others said she needed to be reshod," he said. "The others weren't looking far enough up," Clara said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "Who are you?" "Ethan Caldwell." He took 2 steps into the barn. Not presumptuous steps, careful ones, the way you move around animals when you know enough to know better than to startle them. "This is your mare. My family's." She watched him cross to Duchess's stall, watched him run a hand along the mare's neck in greeting, easy, natural, the gesture of someone who'd grown up with horses not around them. "You're supposed to be at the house." "I am," he said. "In a few minutes." He glanced at the leg. Flexor tendon. Clara blinked. Yes. Compensation from the hoof presenting, but the problem started higher. "How did you—" "My father's best stallion did something similar 2 years ago. Took us 3 weeks to figure out what your hands just found." He looked at her directly for the first time. "How long did it take you?" 3 days, she said. "To be certain." "An hour the first day. 3 days to be sure I wasn't wrong." Something moved in his expression. Not surprise exactly, more like recognition. "You don't guess." "Not about things that matter." "No," he said quiet. "I imagine not." The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. That was the strange thing. Clara had very little practice with silences that weren't uncomfortable. Silences in her house were always loaded with what wasn't being said, with the careful management of conversation away from her and toward something safer. This silence was just air, and the sound of the mare breathing, and the distant murmur of voices from the house. "You should go in," Clara said. "My stepmother will have noticed you're not there." "She has," he agreed. "She sent Violet out to look for me 10 minutes ago." Clara absorbed this. "And you're still here?" He looked at her levelly. "I'm still here." She didn't know what to do with that. She turned back to Duchess, because the mare was familiar, and the man in the barn doorway was not. And Clara had learned a long time ago that when something confused her, she was better off occupying her hands. "She'll need 3 more days of poultice and rest. Then light work. No riding for 2 weeks past that." "I'll tell your father." "He won't listen." A pause. "Then I'll tell him again." She looked over her shoulder. He was watching her with that same expression, the one she still couldn't name, that wasn't pity, and wasn't the careful kindness of someone being polite about something they'd rather not look at directly. "Mr. Caldwell," she said. "Ethan." "You should go in," she said again. He held her gaze for another moment. Then he nodded once slowly, and turned for the door. At the threshold he paused. "The bay roan in the third stall," he said. "What's her history?" Clara stared at him. "Why? Because I'd like to know," he said simply. And then he walked toward the house, and Clara stood in the barn, with the mare's lead rope still in her hand, and her heart doing something entirely inappropriate for the occasion. She told herself, he's here for Violet. She told herself, men like that don't come back to the barn. She told herself, stop it. She was still having that conversation with herself when she heard the house door open and close, and the sound of Margaret's voice rising in welcome, warm and practiced and perfect. She went back to work on Duchess's leg. It was the only sensible thing to do. Supper that night was everything Margaret had engineered it to be. The food was excellent. The lamp light was flattering. Violet was charming in her blue dress, her laugh arriving at precisely the right moments, her questions to Ethan thoughtful and well-prepared. Margaret watched it all with the satisfaction of a general watching a battle go according to plan. And then Ethan said, "Your breeding program, the results this season were remarkable. Whose instinct drives it?" Robert Whitmore opened his mouth. "Robert has wonderful instincts," Margaret said smoothly. "He's built something extraordinary here." Ethan looked at Robert, something careful in his gaze. "Is that right?" Robert's jaw moved once. How was a man who had learned over 19 years of marriage to Margaret that certain conversational currents were not worth swimming against? "Good land," he said. "Good stock." "Good judgment," Ethan said. "That too." Ethan reached for his water glass. Over its rim, very briefly, his eyes moved to the doorway at the far end of the room, the doorway that led to the back of the house, to the kitchen, to where Clara was eating alone at the work table with the accounts ledger open in front of her, the same supper on her plate, the same voices from the dining room drifting through the wall. Margaret saw where his eyes went. Her hand tightened around her fork. She said brightly, "Violet, tell the Caldwells about the Henderson party last month. You were so wonderful." And the table turned smooth as a gear catching, and Ethan turned with it, and was gracious, and was attentive, and laughed at the right moments. But his eyes had gone to that doorway, and Margaret had seen it. And the thing that had been cold and quiet in her chest all evening got colder. In the kitchen, Ruth set a cup of coffee beside Clara's ledger, without being asked. "He looked for you," Ruth said, "twice." "He's being polite," Clara said. Ruth said nothing. Clara turned a page. "Stop," Ruth said. Clara looked up. "You turned that page 12 minutes ago. You haven't read a word of it." Clara looked at the page. Ruth was correct. The numbers blurred slightly meaninglessly, the way numbers do when you're not actually seeing them. "It doesn't matter," Clara said. "Maybe not," Ruth said. "But you ought to let yourself think about it anyway, just for tonight." She picked up the coffee pot and moved back toward the stove. "You're allowed to hope for things, Clara. That's not against any rule I know of." Clara sat with that for a long time. Outside the wagon eventually rolled away from the house. She heard it, the sound of hoofbeats, the creak of the wheels diminishing down the drive. She sat in the kitchen long after the sounds faded. She sat there until the lamp needed trimming and the coffee was cold. She did not let herself go to the window. But she did not stop thinking about it either. He came back on Tuesday. He said he had a question about the yearlings. He spent 20 minutes with the yearlings and an hour and a half in the barn with Clara. He came back on Friday. No stated reason that time. He arrived at the barn, found her there, and they talked for 2 hours about pasture rotation and water rights and a method for reading a horse's stress response that Clara had developed over years of trial and observation and had never explained to anyone before because no one had ever asked. Ethan asked. He asked detailed follow-up questions. He argued with her once about the best approach to reintroducing an injured horse to pasture work, and she argued back, and he listened to her argument and said after a pause, "You're right," with the directness of a man who didn't find it difficult to say those words. Clara didn't know what to do with any of it. She did the only thing she knew how to do. She kept working, kept talking, kept being exactly who she was, and tried not to read too much into any of it. Margaret watched every visit with the focused attention of a woman who has correctly identified a threat. She tried the direct approach first. Clara. She found her in the barn after Ethan's Thursday visit 2 weeks into this new pattern. We need to discuss this. Clara looked up from the feed she was measuring. There's nothing to discuss. Ethan Caldwell is coming here under the pretense of business, Margaret said. And you're encouraging it. I talked to him about horses, Clara said. That's all. You know that isn't all. Clara set down the scoop. She turned to face her stepmother fully. This was unusual. She had learned years ago that facing Margaret directly tended to escalate things in ways that made her life harder. But something about this evening, something about the 2 hours she'd just spent being listened to, genuinely listened to, by someone who wanted to hear what she thought. Something about that made the old posture of careful smallness feel impossible to hold. What is it you're actually afraid of? Clara asked. Margaret blinked. She hadn't expected the question. I'm not afraid, she said. You've been managing me since I was 4 years old, Clara said. Every party, every supper, every visitor. Managing where I stand and what I wear and whether I'm visible at all. That's not normal household management, Margaret. That's fear of something. I manage this household to function properly. You manage this household to look a certain way, Clara said. There's a difference. She picked up the feed scoop again. I haven't done anything wrong. I haven't asked for anything. I've talked to a man about horses on my family's property, and you're standing in a barn at dusk to tell me to stop. What exactly are you protecting? The silence stretched. Margaret's composure held. It always held. That was the infuriating, exhausting thing about her. I'm protecting you, she said at last, and her voice was almost gentle. Men like Ethan Caldwell don't make the choices you think they make. When it comes time to stand up in front of this county and make a permanent decision, he'll make the choice that makes sense for his family and his name and his standing. Not the choice that made for an interesting conversation in a barn. Clara absorbed this. You might be right, she said. But that's his choice to make, not yours. She went back to the feed. Margaret stood in the barn doorway for a long moment. Then she left. Clara kept working, kept her hands moving, kept her face entirely still. But her hands were shaking, not from fear. From something that felt terrifyingly like anger. Real anger. The kind that's been building for 20 years and has finally found an edge to press against. She had not felt that kind of anger in a very long time. She found to her own surprise that she did not entirely want to put it down. The Ranchers Association meeting was on a Saturday. Ethan arrived early enough that the house was still quiet, early enough that the frost hadn't fully lifted from the ground, his breath a cloud in the cold morning air. Clara was at the barn. She was always at the barn. She came out when she heard him, and they stood in the cold looking at each other, and he said it plainly without preamble, in the direct way she'd come to understand was simply how he was come to the meeting tonight. She stared at him. There are 30 ranchers in that room, he continued, arguing about land use and water rights and grazing patterns. You know more about the actual ground under our feet than any 2 of them put together. Your knowledge should be in that room. I'm not. She stopped. Started again. Margaret won't. I'm not asking Margaret. His voice was even, not unkind, but absolute. I'm asking you. The morning air moved between them. Clara looked at him. Looked at him the way she looked at a problem she was genuinely trying to understand. Who was this man? What was he doing? Men did not come to Whitmore Ranch before sunrise and ask Clara Whitmore to attend county meetings. Men did not look at her the way he was looking at her right now, straight on steady, as if her answer mattered, and he intended to wait for the real one, not the one she performed for other people's comfort. People will talk, she said. Yes, he agreed. They'll say things. They will. About you too. I know. She searched his face for the hesitation. The careful backpedaling, the familiar shift in a man's expression, when the social reality of a thing caught up with the impulse that had produced it. She had seen that shift on her father's face 100 times the moment he almost spoke up for her, and then didn't. The moment he started a sentence and let Margaret finish it. She didn't see it on Ethan's face. Why? She said finally. The real question. the one underneath all the other ones. He was quiet for a moment. Because, he said, I'm tired of rooms full of people talking about things they only half understand when the person who understands them best is eating alone in a kitchen somewhere. The cold morning sat around them. From inside the barn, the foal cried the new one 3 days old, still finding its confidence. Clara turned automatically toward the sound, and Ethan followed her, and they went in out of the cold together, and she checked on the small, uncertain animal without saying anything, and he stood a little behind her and didn't say anything either. The foal looked up at both of them with enormous, uncertain eyes. All right, Clara said. She wasn't sure if she was talking to the foal or to him. Maybe both. Ethan said nothing. But when she glanced at him, he was looking at her with something in his expression that she didn't try to name, not yet something she stored carefully away in the part of her that was still learning that some things might be allowed to exist. Tonight there would be a meeting, and Clara Whitmore was going to walk into it. She didn't know yet what that would cost her. She didn't know yet what it would start. She only knew that her hands had stopped shaking, and that for the first time in longer than she could accurately remember, she was not trying to make herself smaller. She stood at her full height in the warm dark of the barn, and she breathed, and she let herself take up exactly as much space as she actually needed. It was, she thought, a beginning. She said yes on a Tuesday morning with frost on the ground, and a newborn foal watching from the straw, and by Saturday she had talked herself out of it approximately 14 times. Each time she found a reason that felt real. The weather, the roads, the fact that she had nothing suitable to wear to a Ranchers Association meeting, which was technically true, but was also, she knew, not the actual problem. The actual problem was that she had spent 24 years constructing a life in which she did not put herself forward, did not ask to be seen, did not walk into rooms where her presence would cause the particular kind of discomfort that her presence tended to cause, and the idea of doing exactly that, deliberately in front of 30 ranchers who had known her father for decades, made something in her chest lock up in a way that no amount of rational argument could fully unlock. She told herself she was being practical. Ruth, who had known her since she was 6 years old, watched her talk herself in circles for 4 days, and finally set a cup of coffee on the work table in front of her and said, "You're going." Clara looked up. "I haven't decided." "You decided on Tuesday," Ruth said. "You've just been arguing with your decision since then." She sat down across from her with her own cup, which she did not do often. Ruth was not a woman who sat when there was work to be done, and there was always work to be done, which meant this was a deliberate statement of intent. "What exactly do you think is going to happen if you walk into that meeting?" Clara wrapped both hands around her cup. "People will look at me. People look at you anyway. People will talk. People talk about you already. They talk about you plenty, and you're not even in the room." Ruth held her gaze steadily. "At least if you're in the room, you get to say something back." Clara was quiet. "He asked you," Ruth said. "Not your father, not your stepmother. He asked you. And you know why he asked you, and it had nothing to do with being kind to the odd girl from the Whitmore place." "You don't know that, Clara." Ruth's voice was not impatient, but it was firm. "I have watched men be kind to you the way people are kind to things they feel sorry for. That is not what this is, and you know it isn't. You're just scared." "Of course I'm scared," Clara said. It came out before she could catch it. The plain, unguarded truth of it. The kind that slips out when you've been holding it too tightly for too long. Of course she was scared. She had every reason to be scared. She knew exactly what Silver Creek Valley looked like when it decided something was funny or sad or wrong about you, and she knew the particular lasting damage of being publicly confirmed in every private suspicion you'd ever had about your own inadequacy. Ruth nodded. "Good," she said. "Fear means it matters. If it didn't matter, you wouldn't need any courage." She picked up her cup and stood, because there was work, and she had made her point, and Ruth was not a woman who belabored things. "Wear the brown wool," she said over her shoulder. "Not the gray." Clara sat with her cold coffee, and the accounts ledger she hadn't opened, and the settled, certain, terrifying knowledge that she was going to that meeting. She wore the brown wool. Ethan arrived at 6, as he'd said he would, with the wagon, and no particular fanfare, and Clara was waiting on the porch because she had decided that if she was going to do this, she was going to do it directly, without giving herself time to reconsider at the threshold. She saw his face when he came up the drive and found her there, already waiting coat, buttoned her good boots on. Something in him relaxed. Something she hadn't known was tense until it wasn't. "Ready," he said. "No," she said. "Let's go." Margaret came to the door. Clara heard it open behind her. She did not turn around. "Clara." Margaret's voice was the careful one, the measured one, the one that sounded like concern and functioned like a wall. "What are you doing?" "Going to the meeting," Clara said. "This is not—" A pause. She was recalibrating, finding the angle. "Your father will be there. Do you understand how this looks?" "I understand exactly how it looks," Clara said. "Get in," Ethan said quietly. Not loudly, not confrontationally. The tone of a man who has decided something and is not interested in arguing about it at length. Clara climbed up before she could think too carefully about the specific mechanics of what she was doing, and Ethan flicked the reins, and they moved down the drive, and the door behind them stayed open for a long moment before she heard it close. She sat in the cold air with her hands in her lap, and her heart running like a horse that has spotted something alarming and hasn't yet decided whether to bolt. "She'll say something to my father tonight," Clara said. "Yes," Ethan agreed. "She'll tell him I embarrassed the family." "Probably." "Does that concern you?" I was quiet for a moment, watching the road. "What concerns me," he said, "is that the person who has the best grasp of the water rights argument we're having tonight wasn't going to be in the room for it. That concerns me considerably more than your stepmother's opinion of me." He glanced at her sideways. "Does that concern you?" She thought about it. "No," she said, and was surprised to find she meant it. The meeting was held at the county hall, a wide, low building that smelled of kerosene and sawdust, and the particular close warmth of too many people in a room designed for slightly fewer. Clara had been inside it exactly twice in her life, once for a town vote when she was 17, once for a funeral when she was 21, and both times she had been invisible in the ordinary way, just a body among bodies. This time was not like that. She felt the shift the moment she walked through the door. It started small. A pause in the conversation near the entrance. Two men from the Henderson Ranch doing the quick involuntary double take that people do when they see something that doesn't fit their expectation of what a space should contain. Then a ripple outward the way a stone disrupts still water, not dramatic, not immediate, but spreading, one person turning to see what the person next to them was looking at. Clara kept her chin level. Her father was across the room, deep in conversation with Thomas Caldwell, Ethan's father, a broad, white-haired man with the bearing of someone accustomed to rooms, listening when he spoke. Robert Whitmore saw his daughter enter and went very still. Clara watched him process it. She watched the series of things that moved across his face in rapid succession: surprise, confusion, a flash of something that might have been pleasure. Then the immediate familiar shuddering as he calculated what this meant for this evening and what Margaret would say about it later. He did not cross the room to her. She had not expected him to. What she had not expected was Thomas Caldwell, who followed Robert's arrested gaze across the room, and then turned to Ethan beside him with an expression of frank curiosity. "Is that the Whitmore girl?" "Clara Whitmore," Ethan said. "Yes." "I didn't know she came to these things." "She hasn't before," Ethan said. "She's going to now." Thomas looked at his son for a moment, with the particular attention of a man reassessing something he thought he already understood. Then he nodded once and turned back to Robert. "Sharp mind from what I hear," he said. "The breeding results from your place this year, that was her work." Robert Whitmore opened his mouth. For one long moment Clara, across the room, and unable to hear the words, watched her father's mouth open, and the old familiar calculation happen behind his eyes. Then she watched him say something, and saw Thomas Caldwell nod in a way that looked like affirmation, and she would not know until much later that what her father had said was, yes, it was her work. Most of what goes right at Whitmore Ranch is her work. She would think about that moment for a long time afterward. The smallest, most private turning, the one that nobody saw, and that didn't fix anything, and didn't make up for the years of the gray dress and the kitchen table and the careful erasure. It didn't fix any of it. But it happened, and she would keep it. The meeting itself was the kind of controlled chaos that happens when 30 men with strong opinions and significant financial stakes try to reach consensus in a warm room. The agenda was water rights, specifically the question of how to divide access to the creek that ran through 3 properties, including the Caldwell Ranch, following a summer of lower than usual water levels that had put every rancher on edge. Clara had been thinking about this problem for 2 years. She had been thinking about it since she first noticed the pattern in the water levels, since she'd started tracking it in the back of her accounts journal, since she'd mapped the upstream usage against the downstream effects, and arrived at a set of conclusions that none of the men currently arguing had gotten close to, because they were looking at this year's problem, and she'd been watching the system long enough to understand it wasn't this year's problem at all. She sat in the back row and listened. She listened to Jim Garfield blame the Caldwells' upstream grazing. She listened to Thomas Caldwell with considerable dignity present the counter-argument. She listened to the Henderson brothers propose a sharing arrangement that sounded reasonable on its face, and would fail completely within 2 seasons, because it didn't account for the aquifer recharge pattern at all. She was quiet for 45 minutes. Ethan, sitting 2 seats away, didn't push her. He let her sit with it. Then Jim Garfield said something that was factually incorrect in a way that was going to get 3 ranches into an agreement that would cost all of them significantly. And Clara said clearly, and without raising her hand, because she forgot she was supposed to, "That's not where the problem starts." The room went quiet. 30 men turned to look at her. Clara had a specific experience of being looked at by a room full of people and having that looking feel like weight, like something pressing down. She felt it now. But she also felt the 2 years of data in her head, solid as ground under her feet, and that was heavier than the looking. "I'm sorry," Jim Garfield said in the tone of a man who was not sorry at all. "I don't believe we've—" "Clara Whitmore," she said. "My family's property borders the eastern section of the contested creek." She stood. "The recharge pattern on this creek runs on an 18-month cycle. This year's low levels aren't because of upstream usage. They're the downstream consequence of a drier than usual season. 17 months ago. I've been tracking it." She looked at Thomas Caldwell. "Your upstream grazing has been heavier this year, but it's not the cause. It's a contributing factor on top of a structural issue that the arrangement you're discussing won't address." Total silence. Then Thomas Caldwell said, "How long have you been tracking it?" 2 years, Clara said. "Do you have the records?" "In my accounts journal, yes." Thomas looked at Jim Garfield. Then he looked at his son. Ethan was looking at Clara with an expression that was not surprise. He had not needed to be surprised, because he had known exactly why he asked her here, but something that was steadier and deeper than surprise. "I'd like to see those records," Thomas said. "I'll bring them," Clara said. "But the arrangement you need isn't a seasonal one. It's a rotational one tied to the recharge cycle. I can walk you through the numbers." Jim Garfield said with significantly less confidence than before. "We don't usually be, Jim," said Thomas Caldwell, and his voice had the quality of a door closing on an argument. "Let her talk." Clara talked. She talked for 20 minutes without notes, from 2 years of sustained attention to a problem that everyone in the room had been treating as this year's emergency when it was actually a pattern. She could feel the shift in the room as she went, could feel the quality of the listening change, the way it does when people stop waiting for you to finish and start actually following what you're saying. When she stopped, the room was quiet in a different way than it had been quiet before. Thomas Caldwell said, "That's the most sensible analysis I've heard in 3 years of these meetings." Someone in the back said, "She's right about the 18-month pattern. I thought I was imagining it." Jim Garfield said nothing for a long moment. Then he said gruffly, "The journal. Bring it next meeting." It was not an apology. It was not warmth. But from Jim Garfield, Clara had learned from 30 seconds of observation. It was approximately the closest thing to both that a person was likely to receive. Robert Whitmore across the room was looking at his daughter. He did not look away. After the meeting, they stood outside in the cold air, people filing past, and Clara had the strange, disoriented feeling of someone who has done something they expected to go wrong and had it go not exactly right, but different from wrong. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was steady. Inside her chest, something was moving around that hadn't been moving before, something that felt almost dangerously like dignity. Ethan appeared beside her. "You didn't tell me you'd been tracking it for 2 years," he said. "You didn't ask," she said. "I'm asking now." "I've been tracking a lot of things," she said. "For a long time. I just didn't have anywhere to say them." I was quiet for a moment. Beside them, Thomas Caldwell stopped to speak to 2 men from the far end of the county, and she heard her name used in his sentence, used naturally. The way you use the name of someone who was just in the room and whose contribution was worth referencing. She heard it and felt it land somewhere deep in her chest, like a stone into still water rippling outward. "Clara." Ethan's voice was careful now, with a different kind of care than he usually used. "My family is hosting a dinner. 3 weeks from Saturday. The main ranching families in the county." He looked at her directly. "I want you there." She looked at him. "Not in the kitchen," he said. "Not in the back. There." The cold moved between them. "Ethan," she said, "I know what I'm asking. Do you—" She studied his face. "Your family has a name in this county. What I did in that room tonight, people will talk about it the way people talk about things that don't fit the picture. And if you bring me to your family's table, that talk gets louder. It attaches to you." "I know," he said. "Then why?" "Because," he said, and his voice was very quiet. Now quiet in the way of something with real weight behind it. "I spent an evening at your family's table watching the person who built half of what makes that ranch worth anything eat alone in the kitchen. And I don't intend to spend another one pretending I don't know that's what's happening." Clara was silent. Somewhere behind her, 2 men from the Henderson Ranch were talking. She could hear her name, and not all of the tone was kind. She heard the word bold used in a way that wasn't entirely a compliment. She heard it and made a choice that was so small it would have been invisible to anyone watching. She decided not to make herself smaller to accommodate it. 3 weeks from Saturday, she said. 3 weeks, he said. She nodded once. Then she walked to the wagon, and he followed, and they drove back in the dark and the cold, and neither of them said much. But the silence was the kind that comes after something real has happened and doesn't need to be filled. She was home before 9. The house was lit. Margaret was waiting. Clara knew she was waiting before she came through the door. Could feel it, the way you can feel weather before it arrives, a particular quality in the air that means something is about to happen. She came in through the back because it was habit and found Margaret in the kitchen, which was the one place in the house that was supposed to be clear of Margaret's deliberate presence. The choice of location was a statement. "Sit down," Margaret said. Clara took off her coat, hung it on the peg, did not sit down. "I'll stand," she said. Margaret absorbed this. Something moved in her expression, not surprise exactly, but a kind of recalibration. She had a specific way of beginning difficult conversations that involved sitting across from the person establishing a physical parallel that subtly reinforced her position of authority. Clara standing changed the geometry of the conversation in a way that Margaret clearly had not planned for. "Your father told me what happened," Margaret said. "What did he tell you?" "That you spoke at the meeting." Her voice was even. "That Thomas Caldwell commented on your analysis." "Yes." "You understand," Margaret said carefully, "what you've done." "I gave an accurate analysis of a water rights problem," Clara said. "I've been tracking it for 2 years. I was right." "Being right is not the point." "What is the point?" Margaret folded her hands on the table, a gesture Clara knew, the gesture of someone settling in for a conversation they intend to control. "The point is that you have put yourself forward in a way that people will not forget. And when people in a county like this don't forget something, it follows you. It follows your family." "It follows you, you mean?" Clara said. Margaret's jaw tightened fractionally. "It follows all of us." "Then perhaps," Clara said, "all of us should have been going to meetings for the past several years instead of just the ones who were permitted to." She looked at her stepmother steadily. "I know things about this ranch and this county that no one else knows because I've been paying attention for 20 years, while everyone was busy deciding where I was and wasn't allowed to be. Those things are useful. They were useful tonight. And I'm not going to pretend they aren't because it makes the picture look tidier. The kitchen was very quiet. Margaret said, Ethan Caldwell. Just the name. The name as a sentence, as an accusation, as a question. He invited me to the meeting, Clara said. I went. And the dinner 3 weeks from Saturday. Clara went still. The only way Margaret could know about the dinner was if someone from the meeting had already spoken to her, which meant either her father had come home and reported the conversation, or someone had called on the house in the time between the meeting's end and Clara's arrival home. In a county this small, the second option was not impossible. In a county this small, information moved the way water moves, seeking the lowest point, finding its way through every available crack. Yes, Clara said. No, Margaret said. Absolutely not. That's not your decision. It is absolutely my decision. Margaret stood now, abandoning the seated authority position for something more direct. Clara, I have protected this family's reputation for 19 years. I have managed every introduction, every gathering, every relationship with every significant family in this county, and I have done it carefully and well, and you going to the Caldwell dinner table as though you belong there will undo everything I've built in a single evening. What you've built, Clara said, has been built on keeping me invisible, on keeping this family respectable, on the idea. Clara said, her voice very steady. Now the kind of steady that comes not from calm, but from something underneath calm, something foundational, that I am a problem to be managed, that my presence is a liability, that who I am and what I know are things to be hidden rather than used. She looked at her stepmother across the kitchen table. I've let you believe that worked. I let you believe it for a long time because it was easier than fighting. But I was in that room tonight, and I was right, and Thomas Caldwell asked to see my records, and 30 men listened to me, and none of the things you have always told me were going to happen. If people saw me, none of them happened, and I'm going to the dinner. The silence that followed was the longest one they'd ever shared. Margaret's face did something complicated that Clara could not fully read. It was too many things at once, too layered, and Clara had spent years learning to read the surface of this woman, but had never been permitted inside the deeper architecture. You'll embarrass yourself, Margaret said finally. Maybe, Clara said, but it'll be my embarrassment. She picked up the lamp from the table. She walked out of the kitchen. She heard her stepmother sit back down, heard the chair scrape, heard the small contained sound of a woman who was used to being the final word, discovering that she wasn't. Clara went upstairs. She sat on the edge of her bed in the dark for a while, the lamp burning low on the nightstand, her hands in her lap. She was shaking. Not from fear, she thought. Or not only from fear. From the accumulated weight of everything that had happened in a single day. The meeting. The room turning to look at her. Thomas Caldwell's voice saying her name like it was worth saying. Ethan in the dark outside, saying he wanted her at the table, not the kitchen. And then the kitchen, and Margaret, and her own voice coming out of her steadier than she'd expected, steadier than she'd known she was capable of. She pressed her hands flat on her knees to stop the shaking. From down the hall she heard her father's door close. He had not come to speak to her. He would not come to speak to her tonight. She knew him too well to expect it, and she had stopped expecting it long ago. But she kept thinking about what Ruth had told her, about what someone had said he said in the meeting when Thomas Caldwell asked about the breeding program. She wanted to ask him directly. She didn't. Some things needed time before you could touch them. Instead, she sat in her room and thought about the dinner 3 weeks away. She thought about what it would mean to walk into the Caldwell house not as a person looking through the window at a room she wasn't allowed to be in, but as a person who had been asked, specifically asked, by the son of the most significant ranching family in the county, who had listened to her talk about horses in a barn at 7 in the morning and had decided on the basis of what she actually was, rather than what she looked like or where she'd been eating her suppers, that her presence in a room added something rather than subtracting from it. She thought about what she'd said to Margaret. She thought about the fact that she'd said it. The lamp burned lower. Outside, something moved in the barn. She knew the sounds of this property, The way she knew her own heartbeat, could identify each animal by the particular quality of its nighttime sounds, and then settled again. Clara lay back on this bed without changing out of the brown wool dress, staring at the ceiling in the dimming light, and felt the day sit on her chest with all its weight. She thought something has changed. She thought there is no going back to the way it was before tonight. She thought, I am frightened. And then quieter underneath all of it, the thought she barely let herself complete, I am not sorry. 3 weeks was a long time, and not long at all. She spent them working, which was what she always did when she needed to think: the barn, the pastures, the accounts, ledger, the slow, patient business of caring for animals who did not have opinions about whether she belonged at dinner tables. She spent them not talking about the dinner with anyone except Ruth, who helped her press the one good dress she owned without being asked, and said nothing about it except, "Hold still, I need to get the collar flat." Margaret spoke to her in the ways that were unavoidable, household matters, necessary logistics, and did not speak to her about the dinner again. She did not need to. Her silence on the subject had the specific, deliberate quality of a decision that had been made at another level in another conversation, the implications of which Clara would feel later but could not yet see. She would understand that silence better in 3 weeks when she walked through the Caldwell front door and found the room arranged in a way that someone had very specifically arranged, and understood for the first time the full shape of what was being done to her. But that was still 3 weeks away. For now, she held the dress Ruth had pressed. She checked on the foal, who was growing into itself with the particular gangly confidence of young animals, discovering that their legs actually worked. She sat with her accounts journal in the evenings and added to the water rights records that Thomas Caldwell had asked to see, making them as clear and complete as she could, because if she was going to be there, she was going to come prepared. She was going to come as exactly who she was. She had spent 24 years learning that who she was wasn't enough. She was about to find out if that had ever been true. The Saturday of the Caldwell dinner arrived, the way significant days always do, faster than expected and heavier than prepared for. Clara had been awake since 4 in the morning. Not because she'd planned to be, but because her body had made the decision for her, pulling her out of sleep into the dark and the cold, with a heart already running at a pace that had nothing to do with physical exertion. She lay still for a few minutes, listening to the house breathe around her, and then she got up, because lying still was worse than moving. She was at the barn by 4:30. The foal was awake. He'd grown into his legs over the past 3 weeks in the determined, ungainly way of young things that haven't yet learned to be self-conscious about the process, and he came to the stall door when he heard her bumping his nose against her palm, with the cheerful presumption of an animal that had decided she was his particular person, and saw no reason to question this arrangement. "I know," she said quietly. "I know." She stayed in the barn until the sky began to lighten. She checked on every horse, did the morning feeding earlier than it needed to be done, repacked a section of the eastern stall wall that had been loose for a week. She worked until her hands were steady and her breathing was even, and the panic that had woken her at 4 had settled into something she could carry. Then she went in, washed her hands, and put on the dress Ruth had pressed. Ruth was waiting in the kitchen with coffee and an expression that communicated without a word that she had been there for a while. "Sit," Ruth said. Clara sat. Ruth set the coffee in front of her and then stood behind her and did something to the back of her collar that Clara hadn't known needed doing. Neither of them said anything for a moment. "My mother wore brown," Ruth said finally. "People always told her it was too plain." She said plain was honest. She patted Clara's shoulder, once the brief, firm pat of a woman who expressed affection in functional gestures rather than words. "You look honest." Clara wrapped both hands around the cup. "What if it goes wrong?" she said. "Then it goes wrong," Ruth said. "And you come home and get up the next morning and go to the barn, same as always." She moved back to the stove. "But it's not going to go wrong." "You don't know that." "No," Ruth agreed. "I know that you've been right about every important thing for 20 years and nobody's been listening. Tonight some of them will. That's not nothing." Clara drank her coffee. She did not feel ready. She went anyway. Ethan arrived at 5, which was earlier than he'd said, and earlier than she'd expected. And she understood when she saw his face that the earliness was deliberate. He'd come before the house could find a way to make leaving harder. He looked at her when she came to the door, and the look was the same one she'd been seeing for weeks now. The one she still didn't have a precise name for, but had stopped trying to deflect. He looked at her the way you look at something you are glad to see. Plainly, without apology. "You look well," he said. It was a simple thing. Men said it to women constantly, automatically, as a social lubricant, as a placeholder for actual conversation. But Ethan said it the way he said most things, without performance, as a direct statement of fact, and somehow that made it mean something different than it usually did. "Thank you," she said. She heard Margaret's footstep on the stair behind her. "Ethan." Margaret's voice was warm, correct, impeccably social. "What a lovely evening for the drive." "Mrs. Whitmore," he said. A pause. The pause of a woman measuring her next sentence very carefully. "I hope Clara won't tire your guests," Margaret said. "She's not always comfortable in large gatherings." Clara turned and looked at her stepmother. Margaret's face was pleasant. Perfectly deliberately pleasant, the expression of a woman delivering a blow so smoothly wrapped in courtesy that calling it a blow would seem like an overreaction. "I'll manage," Clara said. "I'm sure you will," Margaret said and smiled. Ethan held the door. Clara walked out. She heard Margaret say very softly to the air behind them, "Don't say I didn't warn you." In the wagon, Clara sat with her hands folded, and her jaw set, and the particular contained fury of a person who has just been reminded one more time of exactly what they're up against. "She does that," Clara said, not as a complaint, more as information, the way you inform someone of weather conditions when they're going to be walking in it. "I noticed," Ethan said. "She's not wrong that people will talk." "No," he agreed. "She's not wrong about that. But you don't care." Howe was quiet for a moment, watching the road. "I care about the right things," he said. "My family's name, the people who depend on our ranch, the agreements we make with our neighbors." He glanced at her. "I don't care about someone's opinion of who I choose to have at my table. That's mine to decide." Clara looked at the dark road ahead. "Your father," she said. "Does he know I'm coming?" "Yes." "And?" "He's the one who suggested I confirm you were bringing the water rights records." Clara absorbed this. Thomas Caldwell had not merely accepted her presence, he had incorporated her into the business of the evening before the evening had begun. She turned this fact over in her mind carefully, the way you turn a fragile thing, carefully making sure you're understanding it correctly before you put any weight on it. "He's a practical man," Ethan said with a warmth in his voice that was clearly genuine. "He doesn't know me," Clara said. "He knows what he heard at the meeting," Ethan said. That was enough for him. The Caldwell house was lit from every window. By the time they arrived, and there were horses at the post that Clara could identify by ranch, even in the low light, the Henderson Sorrels, the Garfield Blacks. Two unfamiliar roans that meant someone had come from further out than the immediate county. More people than she'd expected. More witnesses. She sat in the wagon for one moment after Ethan climbed down. One private moment she allowed herself and said to herself very quietly, "You know more about this land than anyone in that room. Go in." Then she climbed down. Ethan met her at the bottom and offered his arm. Not with the elaborate ceremony of a man making a statement, but with the simple ease of someone who has decided this is how it is and has no anxiety about that decision. She took it. They walked through the front door together. The room was larger than she'd expected, and fuller, and the moment they entered it, the specific quality of the air changed in the way that rooms change when something unexpected walks into them. She felt it, the pause in conversation, the ripple of attention. She had been in enough rooms to know that kind of ripple from the inside. She kept her chin level. Thomas Caldwell crossed to them immediately, which was deliberate, and she knew it was deliberate. Liberate the patriarch of the house, making the nature of the welcome visible to everyone watching. "Miss Whitmore," he said, and shook her hand the way he shook a man's hand firmly, without the limp-fingered courtesy that men often applied to women in professional contexts. "I'm glad you came. Did you bring the records?" "I did," she said, and she was grateful for the question because it gave her something concrete to stand on in the first 30 seconds, which were the hardest. Good. We'll look at them after supper. He turned to the room. Most of you know Clara Whitmore from the Whitmore Ranch. She presented the water rights analysis at last month's association meeting. For those of you who weren't there, I'll simply tell you it was the most useful 20 minutes that meeting has produced in 3 years. Across the room, Jim Garfield made a sound that was approximately between a cough and an acknowledgement. Clara felt something loosen slightly in her chest. Not fully, but slightly. Then she looked across the room and saw standing near the far window in a dress she had not worn to any Whitmore gathering. Clara had ever attended her stepmother, Margaret. Clara went very still. Ethan beside her felt. It felt the small physical change, the way her arm stiffened against his and followed her gaze. His jaw tightened. "I didn't know she was going to be here," he said very quietly. "No," Clara said. "Neither did I." Margaret was talking to a woman Clara didn't recognize. Her posture, relaxed her expression, the practiced warmth of a woman in her social element. She had not looked toward the door. But that was not Clara knew because she hadn't noticed. Margaret noticed everything. The fact that she was looking away was itself a choice, a deliberate performance of not noticing, designed to be noticed. Clara understood in that moment the full architecture of what was happening. Margaret had not argued with her further after the night in the kitchen. She had not tried to stop her from coming tonight. She had simply found another way to be in the room. She had called on a connection cashed in a social debt, arranged her own invitation to the same table, and now she was here present, a prior claim on this space that predated Clara's arrival, and would Margaret clearly intended overshadow it. She was here to watch, and if the opportunity arose, to manage. Clara breathed. She felt Ethan's hand move to the small of her back, a brief light pressure barely there, the touch of someone saying, "I see it too," without making a scene. "Stay close or move freely," he said low. "Your choice. But you have as much right to this room as anyone in it." "More?" Clara said quietly, and surprised herself with it, the word coming out not with arrogance, but with the flat certainty of something she'd finally stopped arguing against. She moved into the room. The first 20 minutes were the hardest. She could track Margaret through the room, the way you track weather, peripherally, constantly, without looking directly. She watched her stepmother work the space with the fluency of a woman for whom social navigation was a primary skill. She watched her reach two of the older ranchers' wives before Clara could. She watched the conversations that preceded Clara's arrival at any given cluster of people, the small, perfectly placed sentences that she was too far away to hear, but whose effects she could read in the slight shifts of expression, the fractional cooling in how certain people looked at her. Nothing crude. Nothing that could be pointed to and called what it was. Just weather moving through the room before she got there. Clara made a decision. She stopped tracking Margaret. She turned to the man standing nearest to her, one of the unfamiliar ranchers, the ones with the roans who turned out to be from a property 2 counties over, who'd ridden in specifically because Thomas Caldwell had mentioned the water rights discussion, and she started talking. Not about anything calculated, not with any performance of expertise. She asked him about his land because she was genuinely curious about the aquifer patterns in his part of the territory, and he answered, and she said something about the recharge cycle, and he leaned forward slightly, the way people do when they realize they're talking to someone who knows what they're talking about. And within 4 minutes, there were 3 other people in the conversation, and none of them were thinking about who she was or wasn't supposed to be. They were thinking about what she knew. She moved through the room like that. Not confidently in the showy way of someone performing confidence. Steadily. The way she moved through the barn in the dark, familiar with the space in the ways that mattered. Attentive to the things that could trip you, not stopping to announce herself. She ended up near the fireplace with Thomas Caldwell and 2 ranchers from the northern end of the county, and Thomas asked her a direct question about the eastern pasture water patterns, and she answered it, and the conversation that followed lasted 25 minutes and covered 3 counties, and one of the ranchers said at the end of it, "I need to get you to talk to my land manager. He's been arguing the wrong side of this for 2 years." "Happy to," she said, and meant it. Across the room, Margaret was watching. Clara could feel the watching. She didn't look over. Supper was served, and Clara was placed. She saw this noted. It understood that someone had deliberately made this arrangement, not at the far end of the table, but in the middle, beside Thomas Caldwell, and across from Ethan. A position of inclusion, so deliberate. It was itself a message. Thomas had placed her there the way you place something at the center of a table, because that's where it belongs, without making a ceremony of the placement. Margaret was at the far end. Clara sat down and unfolded her napkin, and felt the specific, exhausting emotion of someone realizing that what they'd been told was impossible has just happened, and the impossibility of it is still sitting in them, even as the fact of it is sitting right here at this table, in this chair with these people. Supper went the way. Suppers go when the food is good, and the company is engaged faster than it seemed too loud to follow every conversation, but full enough that the noise itself was comfortable. The noise of people who are present and interested, and not performing anything except their own opinions. Thomas asked her over the main course about the breeding program. "Your father has impressive results," he said. "The yearlings you had at the county show last spring, I inquired about 2 of them. The bay roan and the dark chestnut with the blaze," she said. He looked at her. "Yes, exactly those 2. "Those were my selections," she said. "I've been running the breeding program for 4 years. My father manages the business side." A brief silence, not uncomfortable assessing. "He didn't mention that," Thomas said. "No," she said. "He usually doesn't." Thomas looked down the table toward Robert Whitmore, who was engaged in his own conversation and had not heard this exchange. Then he looked back at Clara. "I'd like to discuss purchasing those 2 animals," he said. "Properly, with you." "I'll need my father present for the financial terms," she said. "But yes." Thomas nodded, and the satisfaction in his expression was the satisfaction of a practical man who has confirmed a thing he already suspected and is glad to have it confirmed. Across the table, Ethan was watching her with that expression she still didn't have a name for. She met his eyes for a moment. She looked away first, not because she was uncomfortable, because the thing in his expression was too large to look at directly for too long. The way certain things are too clear, too certain, too much of what she'd told herself she wasn't allowed to want. Margaret's moment came after supper. Clara had known one was coming, had felt it building through the meal, the way you feel a storm building, the particular atmospheric pressure of a person with something to say, finding the right moment to say it. She'd watched her stepmother talk to the ranchers' wives, watched her move through the post-supper conversation with the fluid ease of a woman waiting for an opening, and she'd prepared herself without knowing exactly what she was preparing for. It came in the side room, where some of the wives had gathered while the men looked at maps. Clara had followed 2 women. She'd been talking to women from the northern county who'd wanted to continue a conversation about land management that had started at the table, and found herself in a room where Margaret was already seated, already central, already the anchor of a different conversation. The 2 groups merged the way groups merge at these things, naturally, without plan. And then, one of the wives, kind-faced, older, from a family that had been in the county as long as anyone, said to Clara, warmly and genuinely, "My husband tells me your water rights analysis was remarkable. He said he wished he'd heard it 3 years ago." "That's very kind," Clara said. "You've been doing this kind of work for the ranch a long time?" the woman asked. "Since I was about 17, Clara said. "Remarkable," the woman said. "I had no idea. I don't think any of us did." She looked at Margaret. "You must be very proud." The room went quiet in the specific way of rooms that have suddenly become interested in what the next sentence will be. Margaret smiled. The smile was perfect. "Clara has always had her particular gifts," she said. The particular. The way the word sat in that sentence, small and precise and devastating. Not your gifts, not such gifts, but her particular gifts. The gifts of a person whose value is specific and limited, whose capabilities exist in a category distinct from the normal run of human achievement. Clara felt it land. She felt the women around her feel it land, the almost imperceptible shift in the room, the recalibration of how several of them were looking at her. She had 2 seconds to decide what to do. "They're not particularly particular," Clara said. Her voice was even. "I understand land use, water systems, and livestock breeding. Those are the core skills for running a ranch in this territory. I've been running the operational side of Whitmore Ranch for 4 years. She looked at Margaret steadily. My stepmother manages the household. I manage the land. We each do what we're suited for. The silence had a different quality now. One of the Northern County wives said slowly, 4 years, and Thomas Caldwell only heard about it last month. Yes, Clara said. That seems like a waste, the woman said with the plain practical judgment of someone who has no patience for inefficiency. It does, Clara agreed. Margaret's smile had not moved. It was still there, still perfect, still entirely in place. But something behind it had gone very flat. The conversation moved on, moved past the moment carried forward by the natural current of social exchange. But the moment had happened, and the room had been in it, and Clara had not retreated from it, and the specific temperature of how the women in that room looked at her had shifted in a way she could feel even though she couldn't quantify it. She excused herself 20 minutes later and went to find the records she'd brought because Thomas Caldwell had said after supper, and after supper was now. She found Ethan in the hallway. He looked at her face and said, "What happened?" "Nothing I couldn't handle," she said. He looked at her for another moment. "Did she? Ethan?" She stopped him. "I handled it." He held her gaze. Then he nodded slowly, and she understood that the nod was not agreement so much as recognition. The recognition of a man watching someone know their own capacity and trusting that knowledge. "The records," he said. "The records," she agreed. They went into the study together. The next hour was in its own way the most extraordinary one Clara had ever spent in a room. 8 maps on the table. Her accounts journal observations, and nowhere official to put them. Thomas Caldwell asking questions that showed he'd already thought carefully about what she'd said at the meeting. Jim Garfield saying with a gruffness that was the closest he apparently got to warmth, "These rotation intervals, you work these out yourself." And Clara saying yes, and him saying nothing more, but writing the intervals down in his own notebook. She watched her father across the table. Robert Whitmore sat through the entire hour with an expression she had never seen on him before, or had seen perhaps very rarely, and had not known how to interpret. It was the expression of a man watching something he helped make, but has never properly looked at, and finding it to be more than he'd understood. At one point Thomas turned to him and said, "You've got a good operation, Robert. Better than most of us realized." Robert looked at his daughter. "Yes," he said. "I do." He said it directly to her. Clara looked down at the map. Her throat was doing something she was not going to permit in a room full of ranchers looking at county surveys. She pointed to the eastern section of the creek. She kept her voice level. She kept going. It was past 10 when people began to leave. Clara stood in the hallway as families collected coats and said their goodbyes, and she shook hands with people who shook her hand back without awkwardness. And one of the Northern County wives squeezed her arm and said, "I meant what I said. Come visit us. Bring what you know." And Clara said she would. Margaret left without speaking to her. She swept past in this hallway with the contained, deliberate grace of a woman who has decided that the exit is the statement, and she was gone before Clara had finished saying goodbye to the family beside her. Robert paused. He stood in front of his daughter in the hallway of the Caldwell house in front of nobody in particular, in the ordinary space between one moment and the next, and he looked at her. "The water rights records," he said. "You've been keeping those for 2 years. "Yes," she said. "On your own?" "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. He was a man of considerable silence. She'd grown up inside his silences. The way you grow up inside, whether accepting them as a condition of the environment rather than a choice. But this silence had a different texture. "I should have been listening better," he said. It was not an apology. It was not a reconciliation. It was a sentence that covered 20 years of erasure and absences and gray dresses and kitchens and far ends of tables, and it covered all of it imperfectly, incompletely, in the way that 5 words can never adequately cover what should have been a different 20 years. But he said it. He said it to her face in a hallway where other people could hear. Clara nodded once. "We'll talk," she said. It was not forgiveness. It was not the closing of a wound. It was a door slightly open that had been shut for a long time. She would see later whether anything could walk through it. Ethan drove her home through the cold dark, and they were quiet most of the way. The comfortable kind of quiet that doesn't need filling. The stars were hard and clear in the Wyoming sky. The road was familiar under the wheels. "You were right," he said finally. "About all of it. About the water rights," she said. "About all of it," he said again. She looked at the road. "Margaret was there," she said. "I know. I'm sorry." "Don't be." She thought about it for a moment. She was there, and it still went the way it went. That matters more than the fact that she tried to stop it. He was quiet. "She'll try again," Clara said. "She won't stop." "No," he agreed. "She won't. Then we'll deal with that." She heard herself say "we," and felt the weight and the rightness of it the way a word can be a door swinging open. "When it comes." Ethan looked at her sideways. "You've changed," he said. "In the last month." "I haven't changed," she said. "I've just stopped pretending to be smaller than I am." He said nothing. But the something in his expression was there again, the one she kept almost naming, and then choosing not to, the one that made her chest do the thing she'd been telling it firmly to stop doing. She looked at the stars. She let herself feel it anyway. When he helped her down from the wagon at the Whitmore gate, he held her hand for a moment longer than the assistance required. Not dramatically, not with any declaration attached, just held it, the way you hold something you are glad to have in your hand. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" "For making me go in," she said. He looked at her. "You made yourself go in." She thought about that. "Then thank you," she said, "for thinking I could." She went inside. The house was dark. Margaret Long abed the kitchen, empty and quiet. Ruth had left a lamp burning on the table and a covered plate beside it, and Clara sat down and ate in the kitchen in the dark, the same as she always had, the same work table and the same lamp. But she was not the same person who had eaten here yesterday. She sat in the kitchen and ate the food. Ruth had left, and outside the barn, the foal moved in the dark, and inside her chest, something she had been keeping under careful guard for 24 years, was shifting, pressing outward against its walls, not ready yet to be fully named, but no longer willing to stay completely contained. She sat with it. She let it be there. For the first time in a long time, she didn't try to talk herself out of it. The talk started within 3 days. Clara had known it would. Silver Creek Valley was not a large county, and it was not a forgiving one when it came to things that didn't fit the established picture and what had happened at the Caldwell dinner. Clara Whitmore, sitting at the center of that table, talking water rights with Thomas Caldwell, while her stepmother sat at the far end, did not fit any picture that this county had been holding of the Whitmore family for the past 20 years. She heard it first from Ruth, who heard everything before anyone else, because people talked freely in front of kitchen workers in a way they didn't talk freely in front of people they considered equals. "The Henderson wives are saying Ethan Caldwell has lost his judgment," Ruth said on Tuesday morning, without preamble, setting down the flower she'd been carrying with a thud that punctuated the sentence. "What else?" Clara said. She was at the work table with the accounts journal. She did not look up. "That your father should have managed things better." Ruth paused. "That Margaret must be beside herself." "What else?" Ruth was quiet for a moment. "That you manipulated the situation. That the water rights analysis was your father's work, and you presented it without his knowledge." Clara's pen stopped moving. She set it down carefully. "That's a lie," she said. "Yes," Ruth said. "It is." Clara sat with the lie. For a moment, felt its specific shape the way it was constructed to take something real and reframe it into something that confirmed what people already wanted to believe. She had done the work. She had been doing the work for years. And the lie being circulated was not that she was incapable, because the meeting and the dinner had made that harder to argue. The lie was that the capability itself had been stolen. That what looked like competence was actually theft. It was, she thought, a very specific kind of lie. The kind that only gets built when someone is threatened. "Margaret," she said. Ruth said nothing, which was answer enough. Clara picked up her pen. She made herself finish the entry she'd been working on. Her handwriting was slightly less precise than usual for the next 2 lines, and then steadied. "I need to speak to my father," she said. "He's in the north pasture," Ruth said. "Won't be back until midday." "Then I'll wait until midday." She waited. She worked. She did not let herself think too far ahead, because thinking too far ahead right now meant thinking about everything that could unravel, and she had learned a long time ago that catastrophizing was a luxury she couldn't afford when there was work in front of her. At midday, when she heard her father's horse in the yard, she went out. Robert Whitmore was a tall man going slightly to gray with her same dark eyes and the hands of someone who had worked land his whole life rather than simply owned it. He looked at her when she came out of the house, and he knew from her face that this was not a casual conversation. He handed his horse off to the ranch hand without taking his eyes from her. "There's a story going around," Clara said, "that the water rights analysis was your work." He was quiet. "Did you hear it?" she said. "I heard something," he said. "Did you correct it?" He was quiet again, and in the quiet, she had her answer, and the answer moved through her like cold water. Not surprise, not anymore. But the specific exhausted grief of someone who has been disappointed by the same person in the same way enough times that the disappointment has lost its shock and kept all of its weight. I didn't spread it," he said. "Clara, I didn't tell anyone." "But you didn't stop it," she said. He looked at his boots. "I didn't know how." "You knew how at the Caldwell dinner," she said. "You said it was my work, directly. You said it to Thomas Caldwell." "Thomas Caldwell is a different situation than your neighbors, than the people you see at church every Sunday." She kept her voice even. It took considerable effort. "Father, someone is calling me a liar. Someone is saying I took credit for work that wasn't mine. And the one person who knows for absolute certain that's false hasn't said a word." The silence stretched between them. Robert Whitmore raised his head. His face was doing the thing it did. The calculation, the measurement, the internal accounting of costs and social debts, and Margaret, and what the neighbors would say. She had watched this face her whole life. She knew every movement of it. "I'll speak to the Hendersons," he said. "Directly," she said. "Or in the way that doesn't quite say anything." He flinched. It was a small flinch. He was a man who'd learned to keep most things internal. But she saw it. "Directly," he said. "And Margaret," she said. Another silence. Longer this time. "Clara," he started. "I'm not asking you to choose," she said, and she meant it because she had given up asking for that years ago, and the giving up had been its own kind of peace. "I'm asking you to tell the truth about your own ranch's records, that's all. Just the truth." She went back inside. She stood in the kitchen for a moment, with her hands on the work table, pressing into the wood, feeling the solid reality of it under her palms. Then she went back to the accounts journal and kept working. She was still working 2 hours later when she heard the horse in the yard, and knew from the sound not the hoofbeats exactly, but the rhythm of the arrival, the way the animal was ridden, that it was Ethan. He came to the back door, which meant he'd come around from the barn, which meant he hadn't announced himself at the front of the house, which meant he'd known enough to avoid that particular theater this afternoon. She let him in. "You've heard," she said. "My foreman heard it at the feed store this morning," he said. "He told me at noon." And he pulled out the chair across from her and sat down in it, and there was something in the directness of that simply sitting down, occupying a chair in her kitchen, with the ease of someone who had decided this was a place he was entitled to be, that she found unexpectedly grounding. "My father is furious," Ethan said. Clara looked up. "Not at you," Ethan said quickly. "At the story. He said to me this morning, and these are his words, 'Someone is trying to undo what that woman built, and I will not sit here and watch it.'" He held her gaze. "He's already spoken to 2 families, directly." Clara absorbed this. Thomas Caldwell, using his name and his weight in this county to push back against a lie about a woman he'd met 3 weeks ago because he'd listened to her for 20 minutes at a ranchers' meeting and understood the quality of what he'd heard. He doesn't owe me that, she said. He thinks he does, Ethan said. He says a man who hears good work and stays quiet when that work is attacked is the same as a man who attacked it. He paused. I think he's right. Clara looked down at the accounts journal. Margaret is doing this, she said. Not a question. I think so, he said. I can't prove it. She doesn't need to put her name on it, Clara said. She never does. She just plants the seed and steps back and lets the county do the rest. She closed the journal. She's been doing it my whole life. I thought, after the dinner, I thought maybe it had run its course. She's scared, Ethan said. Clara looked at him sharply. Don't make excuses for her. I'm not, he said. I'm telling you what's true because it's tactically useful. Scared people make mistakes. They overreach. They do things that are too visible, too direct, and it exposes them. He held her gaze steadily. She's overreaching right now, calling you a liar specifically about records that exist that my father and 8 other men have seen and verified. That's a claim that doesn't survive contact with the facts. She knows what she heard at the meeting. She knows what happened at the dinner. She knows it's too late to make you invisible again. He paused. So she's trying the only thing she has left, which is to make people question your character instead of your capability. Clara was quiet. What do I do? She said. It was a genuine question. She was not a woman who asked genuine questions. Often she had spent most of her adult life being the person who figured things out alone in barns, in margins of account books, in the small private hours when no one was watching. Asking for help with something that wasn't a horse or a fence post felt like standing at the edge of unfamiliar ground and being uncertain of the footing. Ethan didn't treat the question carelessly. You keep going, he said. You bring the water rights records to the next association meeting. You talk to my father about the yearlings the purchase properly at the table. You show up in the places you have every right to show up, and you do the work you've always done, and you let the facts be what they are. He leaned forward slightly. The story Margaret is spreading requires people to believe you've been deceiving your own father for 4 years, and that your father didn't notice, and that Thomas Caldwell and 30 ranchers at a county meeting were all somehow fooled. That story has a weight problem. It can't hold itself up for long. Clara thought about this. Some people will believe it anyway, she said. Because it's easier. Because it fits what they already want to think. Yes, he said. Some will. You can't change that. I know, she said. They sat in the kitchen in the quiet and outside the barn. The foal moved, and somewhere in the house a door closed, and Clara thought about everything Ethan had said, and found that it was underneath the difficulty simply true. The facts existed. She had made them. They were in the journal in her own hand, dated and detailed 2 years of sustained work that predated this conversation by long enough that no story could reframe it. All right, she said. All right, he agreed. He stayed for another hour. They talked about the yearling sale, the specific terms, what she thought they were worth, what she knew about their individual temperament and potential that the sale price should reflect. He listened and asked questions and wrote things in his own notebook, and it was so ordinary, so completely without drama. This 2 people at a work table talking about horses, that Clara felt a sudden vertiginous awareness of how extraordinary ordinary was when you'd never been allowed to have it. She walked him out to his horse when he left, because the day had warmed slightly, and she wanted the air. At the gate he turned. There's something else, he said. She looked at him. My mother wants to meet you. The sentence arrived with a weight she hadn't expected. Eleanor Caldwell was not a woman who appeared often in county social life. She was not ill, simply private, a woman who had built her world at the scale of her own home and her own family, and found it sufficient. She came to church, and to the rare occasion that genuinely required her presence, and was not seen otherwise, and was spoken of with the particular respect that people reserve for those who have made the choice of privacy look like dignity rather than withdrawal. The fact that Eleanor Caldwell wanted to meet her was not small. Why? Clara said. Because she heard what happened at the dinner, Ethan said. From my father. He paused. She said, bring her here. I want to look at her myself. Clara absorbed the specific phrasing. Not bring her for tea. Not have her visit. I want to look at her myself. The language of a woman making an assessment. When? Clara said. Thursday, he said. If you're willing. She thought of Margaret. She thought of the lie traveling through the county at the speed that lies travel, which is always faster than the truth. She thought of Ruth saying you're going, and Thomas Caldwell's hand around hers firm and without apology. I'll come Thursday, she said. He nodded, mounted, looked down at her from the horse with the expression she had finally in the privacy of her own mind in the barn. At 4 a.m, begun to name, though she still wasn't ready to say the name out loud. Clara, he said. What? You're not going to lose this, he said. What you've started. She doesn't get to take it. She looked up at him. Yeah. She wanted to say something about how he didn't know that how nobody could promise that how she'd had things taken from her by quieter means than this for 20 years. She wanted to say all of it. Instead she said, I know. And the thing was standing there at the gate in the November air, with her hands at her sides, and the foal crying softly in the background, and the entire complicated wreck of the last month sitting in her chest. The thing was that she did know. Not with certainty, not with proof, but with the specific stubborn knowledge of a woman who has finally started fighting for something, and found that the fighting itself is a form of evidence. She watched him ride down the drive. She went back to the barn. She had work to do. Thursday arrived gray and cold, and Clara dressed without letting herself think too much about dressing, because thinking too much about it would turn it into something ceremonial, and she needed it to stay ordinary. Brown wool again, because Ruth had been right about honest. Good boots. Her hair done in the simple, clean way she always wore it when she was working, because she was not going to pretend to be something other than what she was. For Eleanor Caldwell, any more than she pretended to be something other than what she was for anyone else. Those days were finished. Ethan met her at the gate, rather than the door, which she understood was his way of giving her the walk and the chance to arrive under her own momentum, rather than being escorted like something fragile. She appreciated it without saying so. The Caldwell house was quieter than it had been the night of the dinner. No crowded hallway, no overlapping conversations, no room full of people recalibrating their opinions. Just a house going about its ordinary business, smelling of wood smoke and coffee, and the particular domestic warmth of a place that had been lived in well. Eleanor Caldwell was in the sitting room. She was smaller than Clara had expected from the weight her name carried in the county. A compact woman in her late 50s with white hair worn simply, and hands that looked like Clara's own, as though they had done real work. She looked up when Clara came in, and she looked at her in the direct, unhurried way that Ethan also looked at things, and Clara understood immediately where he had learned it. Sit down, Eleanor said. Clara sat. Ethan remained standing near the door, and Eleanor looked at him briefly and said, Go do something useful, Ethan. In the tone of a woman who has been deploying that phrase for 30 years, and he went. They were alone. Eleanor looked at Clara with the specific, careful attention of a woman who has raised children and managed a household and watched a county operate for decades, and has learned to read people the way Clara had learned to read horses, by watching what they did rather than what they said. You're not what I expected, Eleanor said. What did you expect? Clara said. I'm not sure. Thomas described you as formidable. Ethan. A pause. Ethan described you differently. How? Eleanor looked at her with something that was almost amusement, or the quiet structural cousin of it. Like someone who doesn't know yet what they are, she said, which is generally more interesting than someone who does. Clara held her gaze. And you're sitting in my chair without flinching, Eleanor said, which tells me the not knowing is probably almost over. A silence. Mrs. Caldwell, Clara said, I want to ask you something directly. Good, Eleanor said. Indirectly is a waste of both our time. The talk that's going around, Clara said. About the water rights records. About my father's work versus mine. You've heard it. I've heard it, Eleanor said. Does it concern you in relation to your son? Eleanor was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice was measured, but not unkind. What concerns me about my son, she said, is that he is 31 years old and has spent the last several years being courted by families with daughters who are perfectly pleasant and entirely wrong for him. What concerns me is that he has been running a ranch of significant size without anyone beside him who actually understands what that means. She held Clara's gaze. The talk does not concern me. People talk. They talked about me when I came to this county as a 20-year-old from Ohio, who nobody knew, and they were wrong about most of it then too. Clara absorbed this. What do you want to know about me? She said. Eleanor leaned back slightly in her chair, and the movement had the quality of a woman settling into a conversation she intends to conduct thoroughly. Tell me about the breeding program, she said. From the beginning. Not the results, the decisions, the ones you made that someone else would have made differently, Clara told her. She told her about the first season she'd taken over the selections when she was 20, and her father had been willing for once to let her try, because he'd run out of better ideas. She told her about the choices she'd made that had looked wrong in the first year and right in the second. She told her about the mare. No one had wanted the one with the reputation for difficult temperament that Clara had understood as fear rather than character, and what that mare's foals had produced in the 4 years since. She talked for 40 minutes. Eleanor listened the way Thomas had listened at the meeting fully, without performance, taking in what was being said, rather than waiting for a pause to respond. When Clara finished, Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The mare no one wanted. Where is she now?" "Still at Whitmore Ranch," Clara said. "She's 12. She has 4 years of good breeding left, maybe 5. If you weren't at Whitmore Ranch," Eleanor said carefully, "where would she be?" The questions sat in the room. Clara understood exactly what was being asked. Not about the horse. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I think you do," Eleanor said. Another silence longer. "I don't make assumptions about things that haven't been offered," Clara said. Her voice was steady. "I've learned that the hard way." Eleanor looked at her for a long moment. "That's fair," she said. Then, "I'm going to tell you something that Ethan doesn't know I'm telling you, because I think you should have it." Clara waited. 2 months ago, Eleanor said. Before any of this, before the meeting, before the dinner, Thomas came home from a business conversation and said to me, "Robert Whitmore has a daughter who runs his ranch, and he doesn't seem to know it." Just that. Just those words. She held Clara's gaze. "My husband doesn't say things like that. He notices things, and he keeps them to himself until they're relevant. He said that to me in October. And then Ethan started coming home from the Whitmore place, looking the way he hasn't looked since—" She stopped. "Looking different." And I connected the two things. Clara felt something move in her chest. "Why are you telling me this?" she said. "Because," Eleanor said, "I want you to understand that what's happening did not begin with Ethan deciding to be kind to you. It began with 2 people, my husband and my son, independently recognizing something real. And I want you to stop treating it like a thing that might be taken away, because you're holding it so carefully, it's going to slip through your fingers." The sitting room was very quiet. Outside somewhere on the property, a horse called out and was answered. "I'm not sure I know how to hold things any other way," Clara said. It was the most honest thing she'd said out loud in years. "No," Eleanor said. "I don't imagine you do. Not yet." She stood, which meant the conversation was closing on her terms, which was clearly how Eleanor Caldwell preferred things. "You'll learn. You have the right temperament for it." She looked at Clara directly. "You have the right temperament for most things, I think." Ethan reappeared in the doorway approximately 30 seconds after his mother stood, which suggested he had not been as far as his mother had sent him. Eleanor looked at him with the expression of a woman who has known this person for 31 years and has given up being surprised by anything he does. "She can take the bay roan," she said, "when the time comes." Ethan looked at Clara. Clara looked at Eleanor. "Thank you," she said. Eleanor nodded once with the brisk finality of a woman who has said what needed saying and sees no reason to elaborate, and left the room. The ride home was different from all the other rides. Something had shifted in the weight of things not resolved, not finished, but tilted toward a different center of gravity than it had been yesterday. Clara sat in the cold air and let herself feel the specific, unfamiliar texture of something going right of people, seeing her clearly, and choosing on the basis of that clear seeing to move toward her rather than away. "What did she say to you?" Ethan asked. "Private conversation," Clara said. He glanced at her. "Was it good or terrible?" "It was honest," she said, "which in my experience is usually both." He almost smiled. "That sounds like her." They rode in silence for a while. "Ethan," she said. "Yes." "The thing I said to your mother about not assuming things that haven't been offered." She looked at the road. "I meant it. I don't want you to think I'm expecting Clara." His voice was very gentle and very direct at the same time, which was a specific combination she had come to understand as characteristic of him. "I know what you're doing." "What am I doing?" "You're building yourself an exit," he said. "In case this goes wrong. You're constructing the version of this where you didn't want it too much, so that if it doesn't happen the way you're hoping you can say, you never really hoped." He looked at her. "You don't have to do that." She was quiet. "I've been doing that my whole life," she said finally. "I know," he said. "You can stop." She sat with that. The gate of Whitmore Ranch appeared ahead. The familiar shape of it, the house beyond the barn, where the foal was waiting. "I'm going to talk to my father tonight," she said. "About the records. About making it clear, publicly clear to whoever needs to hear it where that work came from." "Good," Ethan said. "He may not do it. He might surprise you," Ethan said. "He surprised you before." "Once," she said. "Once is how it starts," he said. He helped her down at the gate and held her hand a moment longer than necessary, and she let him this time, without the internal argument, without the management of her own reaction, without the careful construction of reasons why this didn't mean what it felt like. She let it mean what it meant. She went inside. The kitchen was warm, and Ruth was there and said nothing, and Clara sat down and said, "I need to talk to my father after supper." And Ruth said, "He's in the study," and that was all. After supper, she knocked on the study door. Robert Whitmore looked up from his desk. She came in. She closed the door. She sat down in the chair across from him, not the chair in the corner, not the careful peripheral position she usually occupied in this room, but the chair directly across from his desk, the one that meant you are having a conversation with me now, not a conversation that includes me as an afterthought. He looked at her. "I need you to write a letter," she said, "to the Ranchers Association, stating clearly that the water rights analysis and the breeding records are mine, that I have been running the operational side of this ranch for 4 years, that the results of the past 2 seasons are the result of my work." He was very still. "That's Clara. That's a significant thing to put in writing." "Yes," she said. "I know." "Margaret will. I know what Margaret will do," she said. "I'm asking what you're going to do." She held his gaze. "You told Thomas Caldwell the truth at his dinner. You said those words in front of his family and his guests, and that was the most I've ever heard you say on my behalf in 20 years, and I know it cost you something." She leaned forward slightly. "I'm asking you to do it again, in writing, where it can't be walked back." Robert Whitmore looked at his daughter across his desk. How was calculating? She could see it. The familiar accounting Margaret on one side, Clara on the other, the social costs, the marital costs, the cost of finally. After 20 years, saying in a format that left no room for misinterpretation. What was true? Then something in his face settled. Not resolved, not at peace, but decided. "Get me the pen," he said. Clara reached across the desk and handed it to him. She sat in the chair directly across from her father and watched him write, and outside the study window, the Wyoming dark was complete and cold and full of stars. And inside the room, the only sound was the scratch of the pen on paper and the slow, difficult, long overdue movement of a man choosing finally to tell the truth about his own daughter. It was not everything. It was not 20 years given back. But it was the pen moving on the paper, and it was his hand holding it, and it was her name being written down in a context that could not be erased or managed or redirected into something more comfortable. She sat very still and watched it happen. She did not look away. The letter went out on a Friday. Robert Whitmore had written it himself in his own hand on the ranch's formal stationery, the kind he reserved for contracts and legal correspondence, the kind that carried weight because of the paper it was written on as much as the words. Clara had watched him write it the night before and had not read it until he handed her the sealed copy in the morning. And when she read it, she had to set it down and stand at the kitchen window for a moment, because the language was more direct than she'd expected. He had not hedged. He had not softened. He had written in plain sentences that the water rights analysis presented at the October Association meeting was the work of his daughter Clara, developed independently over 2 years without his direction. That the breeding program's results for the past 4 seasons were the product of Clara's selections and management. That any suggestion to the contrary was incorrect, and he was prepared to say so in person to anyone who required it. He had signed it with his full name. Ruth read it over Clara's shoulder and said nothing for a moment. Then she said, in the specific tone that meant she was more moved than she intended to show, and went back to the stove. Clara folded the letter and put it in her coat pocket and kept it there all day, not because she needed to look at it again, but because she needed to know it was there. The letter reached Thomas Caldwell by Saturday morning. By Sunday, it had been seen by 3 other families. By Monday, the specific version of the story that Margaret had been circulating, that Clara had misrepresented her father's work, had encountered the letter head-on and collapsed the way a structure collapses when its load-bearing wall is removed. Not all at once, not dramatically, just quietly, inevitably, the whole shape of it losing integrity and falling inward. Jim Garfield stopped Clara outside the feed store on Monday afternoon and said without preamble, "Your father sent me a copy of his letter." He looked at her with the expression of a man who does not enjoy being wrong, and has decided the most efficient response is simply to move past it. "The rotation intervals in your records. Can you have them to me by the end of the week?" "I can have them to you by Wednesday," she said. He nodded, walked away. That was the entirety of it. She stood on the boardwalk for a moment after he left and felt something almost like laughter trying to rise in her chest. Not the bitter kind, not the exhausted kind, but the real kind. The kind that comes when the absurdity of something and the relief of something land at exactly the same moment. She held it together until she was back in the wagon, and then she let out a breath that had been building for approximately 3 weeks, and gripped the reins and looked at the flat Wyoming sky, and felt with startling clarity that she was still here. That she had come through it, and she was still here, still herself, not diminished by it, not broken. She drove home. Margaret was waiting on the front porch, not pacing. Margaret did not pace. She considered pacing beneath her, but standing in the specific way that communicated she had been waiting for some time and intended the waiting itself to be a statement. She watched Clara climb down from the wagon and tie the horse and walk up the steps, and her expression was composed in the way a battlefield is composed after the fighting has stopped. All the action finished. The landscape changed, the cost not yet fully tallied. "He didn't discuss it with me," Margaret said. "No," Clara said. "I don't imagine he did." "That letter," Margaret paused. "You have to understand what that puts him through. The conversations he's going to have with people who've known us for 20 years. The questions." "He knows," Clara said. "He sent it anyway." Margaret absorbed this. Something shifted in her face. Not defeat, not exactly, but a kind of recalibration. The expression of a person who has been conducting a campaign from a specific position and has just discovered the ground under that position is no longer solid. "I was protecting this family," Margaret said. And then something Clara had never heard from her before, a note underneath the control, something rawer than the managed voice she usually deployed. "I was protecting what we built." "What you built," Clara said carefully, "required me to be invisible. That's not building something. That's just making sure something isn't in the way." Margaret said nothing. "I don't hate you," Clara said. "It came out even because it was true, and true things had that quality. I want you to know that. I don't hate you. I think you made decisions about me when I was 4 years old, and you've spent 20 years trying to make those decisions look correct. And I think that's exhausting, and I think part of you knows they weren't right." She held Margaret's gaze steadily. "But I'm done disappearing to make it easier." The porch was very quiet. Margaret looked at her the way Clara thought she had never quite looked at her before. Not assessing for social liability, not calculating management, just looking. "You're going to marry him," Margaret said. It was not a question. It was not an accusation. It was stated the way facts are stated when they have been recognized, and the speaker has made their peace with them. Clara didn't answer, not because she was hiding anything, but because some things hadn't been spoken yet in the right conversation with the right person, and she was not going to let Margaret be the first to name them. "Go inside, Margaret," she said gently. And after a moment Margaret did. Clara stood on the porch alone for a moment, looking at the ranch, the barn, the pasture, the fence lines she'd walked 1,000 times, the land she knew better than any room she'd ever sat in. It was hers. Not legally, not on paper, but in the way that matters more than paper, in the way that comes from 20 years of attention and care, and showing up at 4 in the morning because something needed you. She breathed. She went inside. 3 days later, Ethan came to the ranch in the early morning, the way he had been coming for months now, and Clara was at the barn, the way she always was, and he came to the barn door and stood there and looked at her, and she looked at him, and both of them were quiet for a moment. "My mother liked you," he said. "I know," she said. "She told me what she said to you." Clara looked at him. "Which part?" "The part about holding things too carefully." He came further into the barn, not stopping at the doorway this time, but coming all the way in to where she was standing beside the foal's stall. The foal had grown into something fine over the past 2 months. Still young, still learning the translation between intention and coordination, but with a clear quality to him that Clara had been watching develop with quiet satisfaction. "She said you told her you didn't know how to hold things any other way." "I said it was honest," Clara said. "It was." He stood beside her, both of them looking at the foal, and she was acutely aware of his presence, the way she was always aware of it. Now the specific quality of standing next to someone who does not make you smaller by their proximity. "I want to ask you something," he said. "Then ask it," she said. He turned to face her, and she turned to face him. And in the barn, in the early morning light with the foal watching from behind the stall gate, Ethan Caldwell looked at Clara Whitmore with the expression she had been almost naming for 3 months and said, "Will you let me?" She looked at him. "Let you what?" she said, though she knew. She knew exactly. But she wanted to hear it said plainly, without implication, without the soft hedging of a question that's really a statement dressed up with borrowed caution. She wanted to hear it the way she heard everything that mattered directly. "Let me ask your father," he said. "Properly. Let me do this the way it should be done." The barn was very quiet. The foal bumped his nose against the stall gate. Clara felt the whole weight of the past 3 months, the morning in the barn, when Ethan first appeared in the doorway, the meeting, the dinner, the letter, Margaret on the porch, Eleanor in the sitting room, telling her to stop holding things like something about to be taken. She felt all of it sit in her chest at once. Everything that had led here, every small decisive moment, and underneath it, she felt the thing she had been trying not to feel too directly since October. The thing she'd been keeping at a careful arm's length because she hadn't trusted yet that it was real and permanent, rather than something that would shift the moment she put her full weight on it. She put her full weight on it. "Yes," she said. He looked at her for a moment with that expression fully present, fully named, nothing held back in it, and she understood that this was what it felt like to be seen completely by someone and have them choose on the basis of the complete and unedited truth of you to stay. He went to speak to her father that morning. Clara stayed in the barn. She was not hiding, she was done. Hiding had been done for weeks now, the way you're done with something that has served its purpose and is no longer required. She stayed in the barn because she needed to be somewhere with her hands occupied while the conversation happened, because she was human and she was nervous, and the horses were better company for nervousness than standing in a hallway trying to look unconcerned. Ruth appeared at the barn door 20 minutes later. "He's talking to your father," Ruth said. I know, Clara said. Your father looks, Ruth paused, like a man who isn't surprised and is trying to figure out what to do with not being surprised. Clara almost smiled. And Margaret, she said. In the parlor, Ruth said, sitting very straight. How straight? Like she's expecting a photograph to be taken, Ruth said. Clara breathed. All right, all right. Ruth agreed and went back to the house, because Ruth was a woman who delivered information and then got out of the way, which was one of her most valuable qualities. The conversation lasted 40 minutes. Clara measured it in horse tasks, a full feeding a hoof check on Duchess, who was fully recovered and moving beautifully, a thorough inspection of the eastern stall wall she'd repacked 2 months ago. 40 minutes of ordinary work in the ordinary light of a November morning, while inside the house, the shape of her life was being formalized. Ethan came to the barn when it was done, and she knew from his walk, she had learned his walk, the way you learn the particular gait of someone you've been watching come toward you across a yard for months, that it had gone well. Not from ease or celebration, but from the specific settled quality of a man who has done a difficult thing and had it come out right. He said yes, Ethan said. I know, she said. You knew. I know my father, she said. He wrote the letter. That was the harder thing. Yes was going to be easier. Ethan looked at her for a moment. And you, apart from your father, apart from everything else. Do you? Yes, she said. I already said yes. In the barn. A yes is a yes, she said. The location doesn't change it. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I didn't bring a ring. I didn't think. I don't need a ring right now, she said. I needed the question. You asked it. He crossed the barn in 3 steps, and he took her face in both hands. Her calloused, capable hands covered by his. And he looked at her with everything present in his face, and not a single thing held back, and he said quietly, There has never been anything wrong with you. There was never a single thing that needed fixing or hiding or apologizing for. I need you to know that. Clara felt her throat close. She had heard many things said to her in 24 years. She had heard that she was capable, useful, impressive in the specific limited way of someone whose skills were valuable, but whose person was a problem to be managed. She had heard kind things said with a ceiling built into them. She had never heard it said like this without qualification, without the small structural exception that was always built in somewhere, without the silent, but that lived at the end of every compliment she'd ever received. She breathed. I'm starting to know it, she said. It was the most honest answer she had. He kissed her forehead, and she let him, and the foal watched from the stall, with the benevolent indifference of an animal that has decided this is an acceptable development, and has already moved on to thinking about breakfast. The announcement was made at the next Ranchers Association meeting, which was December's, and Thomas Caldwell made it himself at the beginning of the meeting, before any business was discussed, because he was a man who understood that some things should be established clearly before you get to the agenda. He said his son Ethan was engaged to Clara Whitmore of Whitmore Ranch. He said it the same way he'd said her name at the October meeting, as though it was simply information real and significant, that he was communicating to people who should know it. No ceremony around it. No elaborate framing. Just the fact of it placed in front of the room. The room received it the way rooms receive things that surprise some people, and confirm what others had already understood was coming. Jim Garfield said nothing, but he nodded. Once. The nod of a man who files information and moves forward. Someone from the back of the room, one of the younger ranchers, a man Clara didn't know well, said good, and then looked immediately like he hadn't intended to say it out loud, and then decided not to apologize for it. Clara was in the room when it was said. She had been coming to every meeting since October, and her presence had become over the course of those weeks simply a thing that was true rather than a thing that required comment. She sat in the middle of the room now, not the back that had changed on its own, sometime around the 3rd meeting, when she'd realized she was no longer sitting in the back because she felt she should, and started sitting where she could hear and be heard. When Thomas made the announcement, she kept her expression steady and her chin level, and she did not look around to read the room, because she had decided sometime in the last week that she was done managing her existence according to what rooms thought of her. After the meeting, The woman from the northern county, the one who had squeezed her arm at the Caldwell dinner and said, "Come visit us," found her and said, "I'm glad," and hugged her, which was unexpected and completely genuine, and made Clara's eyes do something she firmly managed before anyone could see it. Margaret did not come to the meeting. She had not spoken to Clara about the engagement directly. She had received the news Robert had told her in the study with the door closed, and she had been, by Robert's brief account to Clara afterward, very quiet. Not explosive, not dramatic, just quiet in the way of someone absorbing a shift in the landscape that is permanent and significant, and requires an entirely new set of calculations. Clara did not press for more than that. She was not going to pretend that Margaret had become someone different. She was not going to reconstruct her stepmother into a reformed figure because the story wanted one. Margaret was who she was, a woman who had made choices about a 4-year-old girl and had defended those choices for 20 years with the full force of her considerable capability, and who was now in a room somewhere being quiet with the consequences. Clara could be honest about that and also be done with it. Both things were true at once. That was enough. The wedding was set for the following spring, when the ground was soft and the light was long, and the ranch had come through another winter and stood ready for a new season in the particular determined way of things that have survived difficulty and intend to keep going. Eleanor Caldwell became over the months between the engagement and the wedding. Something Clara hadn't expected and didn't have a ready name for. Not a mother, because Clara had learned to be careful with that word, but a presence. A woman who had seen her clearly from the first sitting room conversation and continued to see her clearly, who called her twice a week to talk about land management and breeding decisions, and once memorably to argue about the best approach to a horse with a confidence problem. An argument Clara won, and Eleanor conceded, with the particular grace of someone who enjoys losing to someone better informed. She brought the water rights records to the county assessor's office in February and had them formally entered into the county record under her name, which was a thing she could do now, which was a thing that was allowed, which still amazed her in the specific way that rights amaze you when you've spent a long time without them. She walked into the assessor's office alone. She put the records on the counter. She stated her name and her purpose. The clerk, a young man who had grown up in the county and knew the Whitmore name, looked at the records and said, "These are thorough." "Yes," she said, "they are." He entered them into the record. She walked out. The spring wedding was attended by most of Silver Creek Valley, because most of Silver Creek Valley had decided by that point that this was a thing worth attending, partly because of the Caldwell name, which commanded attendance on its own, and partly because of something else. Something harder to name, the specific social gravity of a story that people had watched unfold over the preceding months and felt in some instinctive way that they wanted to be present for the end of. Clara wore blue, not the gray, not the careful, self-effacing brown of honest labor, though she would wear that for the rest of her life and be glad of it. Blue, the specific deep blue of the Wyoming sky in October, which was the month she had walked into her first room and refused to be invisible. Ruth pressed the dress. She didn't say anything while she pressed it. She didn't need to. 20 years of kitchen mornings and cold suppers, and kept secrets and small dignities preserved in private. All of it was in the room with them, not as weight, but as history, the kind that makes you who you are, and then allows you to be something more. When she was done, Ruth stood back and looked at her. "Your mother would have liked him," Ruth said. Clara felt it land, the specific, irreplaceable weight of those words. The mother she had lost early enough that she carried the absence more than the memory. The mother whose broad shoulders and strong legs Clara had inherited, along with the capacity for hard work and the refusal to be made smaller than she was. "Tell me something about her," Clara said. Ruth was quiet for a moment. "She laughed loud," she said. "Like you. People used to say it wasn't ladylike." She paused. She didn't stop. Clara breathed. "Good," she said. She walked down to the front of the house where the wagon was waiting, and the day was bright and cold and full of the particular Wyoming light that turned everything gold and clear and worth seeing. And Ethan was there at the bottom of the steps, not in the barn, not at the gate, but here at the front of the house at the door. She had spent years not walking through, and he looked at her the way he always looked at her and held out his hand. She took it, not carefully, Not provisionally. Not with the internal reservation of someone who is already preparing for the moment. The good thing is taken away. Fully. Without apology. They walked in together. Margaret stood near the back of the assembled guests, dressed well, and held together with the particular composure of a woman who has decided that whatever she is feeling, she will not be undone by it in public. She watched Clara walk in. She did not look away. And Clara, for the first time in 20 years, did not look down. She met her stepmother's eyes across the room, across the guests, and the good light, and the gathered evidence of a life that had refused to stay invisible. And she held the look for a moment, not with triumph, not with anger, both of which she had a right to, but with something simpler and more durable than either. Recognition. I see you, and I see what you did, and I am still here. Then she looked forward. To Ethan and Thomas and Eleanor, who was watching her with warm, direct eyes from the front row, and Ruth, who had come in from the kitchen for the first time in 20 years, because she had decided this particular occasion required her presence in the room rather than behind it. To the whole gathered county, which had looked at her many ways over many years, and was looking at her now at last completely as someone who had always been exactly where she was supposed to be. Clara Whitmore had spent 24 years being told in every way a person can be told, without the words being said directly, that she was too much and not enough, too large, too direct, too capable, in ways that made the wrong people uncomfortable. Not soft enough, not small enough, not the right kind of girl for the right kind of room. She had believed it in the cellular way that you believe the things that are said about you before you know enough to argue back. She had stopped believing it in a barn at 7 in the morning by degrees over the course of a season in the presence of a man who looked at her hands and saw what they could do. She had proven it at a meeting and a dinner table, and in a letter written in her father's hand, and in an assessor's office, and in a dozen quiet, ordinary, irrefutable moments where she simply showed up and did what she knew how to do. And now she stood in a room full of people who had tried for years to make her invisible, and she was the most visible person in it, and she had not changed a single thing about herself to get here. She had only stopped apologizing for what she already was. That was all it had ever taken. That was the whole of it. Clara Caldwell, née Whitmore rancher, keeper of water rights records and breeding journals, reader of horses and land, and the long patient truth of things, took her place at the front of the room and did not look back. She had always belonged here. She knew that now. She was never going to let herself forget it again.